this change happen. Otherwise, we're just going to sit idle by and not do anything at all, which we can also see the developing countries, my opponent's argument, over that they would eventually do it themselves. If they can't afford food and homes for the country, what makes my opponent think that they can afford green energy and wasting food crops on new types of energy, along with other means of becoming greener? So the simple fact is that only the higher countries can afford this right now. And therefore we have to see that they have the higher obligation. They have to set the standard. They have to protect these nations by giving them this energy. And without their help, there's no way that the world will become greener. There's no way these developing countries will develop alternate energy or other green methods.
Throughout this debate, we have ignored many various things. So I'm going to work on pointing out those various things that have been forgotten, and we can truly see that developed countries do not have higher obligations. First off, we need to take a look at the fact that whenever all these problems started happening, and by the people who were placing this blame on, they did not initially know that they were doing this. Back in the 1980s and the 1990s is truly whenever this whole idea that we are causing global warming and we're actually polluting our Earth really came to be. Now, at this time, it's really too late to start placing blame because no one really knew about it at the time. So that is something that we first must have to realize and understand, is that these developed countries, even though they are polluting our Earth, they also did not know about it initially. And now that they have realized that this is what's happening, they're actually taking their steps right now. And so we cannot place them with a higher obligation to actually work on adjusting how the world works and not really having much of a higher obligation. But instead, we must also do something such as working all together as one. It's been stated that all this blame placing that has been occurring is actually slowing down the process of us achieving our goals. That we're sitting here and we're constantly saying, all right, you're the one who actually needs to put more work towards this. No, you are. No, you are. And in the end, it just becomes this constant repetition of people placing blame on each other, but no one is actually working towards producing various methods that are actually going to work on reducing what's happening. And so we can also see that something that also has been forgotten is that there are various countries that do specialize in certain things. Now, sometimes these things are high in carbon emissions, but we also forget to mention that these things that they are producing that are high in carbon emissions are also something that is reducing the need for other countries to produce that. So we're kind of looking at it one-sided. We're not looking at the very complex issue that it is, that some of these specialized states will actually produce more carbon emissions while they're actually not producing that many in the end, because they're reducing the need for other countries too. And then also, if we take a look at undeveloped countries and developing countries, many of them do not have emissions regulations right now. So they're working on doing so much stuff that it's actually causing additional pollution, because these countries are not placing regulations on these individuals. They're not doing something that's saying you can only produce this much emissions into the atmosphere. And that is something that we've had in developed countries. So we can really see that that's something that first needs to be done by undeveloped and developing countries. And that is something that we cannot change as a developed country. And then also something that has been forgotten is that there are developing countries that also produce more carbon emissions. China is currently still classified as a developing country, and they are the largest polluter on this earth. So we can see that there is much that needs to be done before we can actually place the blame on developed countries that's having the higher obligation. Thank you.
The few things that we really need to focus on right at this moment is the fact that these developed nations do have a higher obligation to combat climate change. First and foremost, one of the major implications of this is that developed nations actually caused this problem because they were trying to become developed, even though they didn't know it, as my opponent spoke in his last speech, they still cause a problem. And that comes with that idea that even though you're ignorant about you causing a problem, doesn't mean you should be able to pass the blame and pass the obligation on to someone else. At the same aspect, one of the other things was the developing nations. The important thing about this is that the developed nations and the developing nations will follow suit if a strong developed nation, in fact, takes that initiative and takes that obligation to combat climate change. And they must, in fact, set that standard, because if you do not set that standard, then no one will follow in that, and you can realize that it won't be as important as it once had. Another key issue that we should be focusing on, it's not about how, but how efficient we can actually combat climate change. And by realizing that these developed nations have a higher capability to in fact combat, it further puts that obligation on these developed nations, not only because they have impacted and added to the fact of climate change, but because they can actually do so much greater in combat that. And once again, there are so many people in this world, and we shouldn't place the burden on other nations that are developing and are trying to place their foot in this world. But we should in fact realize that those developed nations, that even though they didn't know in the past and were ignorant in the past of what they were doing, they in fact need to take that obligation and put their foot in the door and in fact combat climate change. Because once they do that, other nations will in fact follow suit.
Throughout this round, we've been focusing on whether or not developed nations have a higher obligation, but we haven't really figured out why they have or haven't. Now, I would like to point out to you that while developed nations might have more funds and more capability to produce the energies needed, they don't have the raw materials. The developing countries are going to have to provide them with the raw materials, in which case they would sell them and gain some profit. Then they could get the energies back from the developed nations, and the nations can work together. By working together, they're going to be able to create a system that's going to be much, much more efficient than if only one group of countries works. If every single one of the countries on this earth participates in every single possible way, then they're going to create a much healthier, more prosperous system of trying to combat climate change. Now, the developed do not have a higher capability than any other country. They only have that higher capability if they rely on what they get from developing countries. Every single country in this world works together in an intricate system. If you break apart that system, chaos occurs. This is why we have to understand that all countries have the same obligation. Countries such as China, who are huge polluters, are considered developing. They have themselves begun to develop green energies. They've begun to develop ways to create a new world that's not going to involve one country being better than any other. By doing this, we can clearly see that all countries are equal and developed nations do not have the highest obligation. Also, many countries did not know until roughly the 1980s that we actually had global warming, so we can't put the blame on any one country in specific or say that any one or two countries has a higher obligation to combat anything. Clearly, developed nations do not have a higher obligation and all countries are equal. Thank you.
High school. Every one nation should be doing their best to combat climate change. However, despite counter-arguments, the truth still stands that developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change. The evidence has shown that developed countries have caused more damage to the environment because of their high per capita emissions. Though they may not have done it on purpose, due to the fact that developed countries are the cause of more of the environmental damage, they would also have a higher impact in the world if they took steps first. Developing nations currently aren't the leaders in emissions, so their steps to cleanliness would not do as much. This is another reason why developed nations have a higher obligation. Next, as already been stated, developing countries don't want to take leaps until developed countries do. They need support. As UN IPCC Chair Rohinda Pachuri said, it is essential for the U.S. to take action. The rest of the world looks to the U.S. for leadership. The way the world sees it, if developed nations don't take a stand, no one will. Thank you.
Now, once again, if we look through everything that has been discussed in today's debate, we can really see that we've essentially been wasting the time on actually moving forth and fixing this problem. That we're trying to figure out who is higher obligated, yet instead of doing this, we should actually be going out and doing various changes to actually help improve our world. Instead of sitting here and saying, all right, well, developed countries should do this. No, developing. No, this, no, that. In the end, we've all just wasted time because we're not going out there and putting forth work. And that is why undeveloped countries do not have a higher obligation. Everyone has a high obligation. And this obligation should be within every country, whether they are developing, developed, or undeveloped. Now, this is something that we have to work for, and we have to have this unity before our world can really change a worldwide problem. That's why it's called global warming, because it's happening all across the globe. And together to solve this, we must work together as an entire globe. Thank you.